Good evening and welcome. Removing unreasonable hurdles that victims previously faced in pursuit of compensation. This is the mandate of the Accident Compensation Commission of Fiji, and tonight my guest on the show is their CEO, Mr. Parvez Akbar. Sir, good evening and welcome.
Good evening, Ziad.
Since the last time that you were on for the record, which was, I'm guessing, when the ACCF was first initiated, there have been some changes starting January 2018, changes yet in 2019. So if you could give us a brief update on what the ACCF now does and its scope of work.
Sure, thank you, Ziad. Now, we first started operations in January last year, and we started off compensating for injuries and deaths from motor vehicle accidents. And in the budget last year, the Minister for Economy, the Honourable ACCA, announced the expansion of ACCF into the areas of employment and school accidents. And so since this year, we've been receiving and processing applications for employment and school accidents.
So what other changes have been made to the laws? I believe that there was a previous act in force that covered some aspects of this that was repealed.
Sure. So there used to be a Workmen's Compensation Act, and the title itself suggests that it was outdated if it's a Workmen's Compensation Act. But that needed to be repealed. It needed to be made more victim-friendly, and we wanted to move to a scheme that was on a no-fault basis, so not having workers to have to prove fault of the employers, etc., removing bureaucracy, legal proceedings, and so on. So the Workmen's Compensation Act has been repealed, and that's been replaced by a few regulations. So you've got the Accident Compensation Employment Accidents Regulations, and we've also got the Accident Compensation School Accidents Regulations that have been introduced to cater for these two types of accidents.
And the ACCF is the enforcement body or the body that is...
Well, actually, and I'm glad you've asked that question, ACCF's mandate and core function is to pay compensation. So we're not actually an enforcement or regulatory body in that sense. Our role is to receive applications and process applications for compensation and to pay out compensation for those to those who qualify. In terms of enforcement, that and for things like the 2/3 salary that employees are entitled to if they're away from work because of a work-related accident, those sorts of things will still be enforced and regulated by the Ministry of Employment. So we have a close working relationship with the Ministry of Employment.
So the ACCF has, said that the scheme, in fact, all of the schemes, are primarily designed to remove unreasonable hurdles that victims of accidents faced while they were trying to get compensation.
Yes.
So talk to us about some of these previous schemes and compare them with the ones that we have right now. What were some of these unreasonable hurdles?
So if we start off in the motor vehicle space, in the past you might recall motor vehicle owners would have to buy a third-party policy from any insurance company, and that insurance company, policy would have certain requirements. They would have a lot of exclusions, and it was based on a fault-based system under common law. So if you had a claim, you would go to a lawyer if you were injured or if there was a death as a result of a motor vehicle accident. Now, of course, if you're engaging lawyers, there's a cost involved,
right.
And there's a process to follow, and in that process, a number of people faced a lot of hurdles. I've experienced that firsthand as a lawyer representing applicants in these kind of situations or victims of accidents in the past. The fault requirement was quite onerous. We've seen, and I can talk about this now or even later, but we've seen many examples where victims of accidents were actually at fault. Now, under the previous law, they would miss out on compensation because they would never be able to prove fault of the driver, for example. And we've seen that, many of them actually, a few payments we've made where we can see that those particular families or the victims would struggle to prove fault of the driver because it was actually their fault, possibly.
Is it generally, when the onus is upon the victim, is it generally difficult to prove fault?
I mean, based on my own experience in the past, I mean, if you envisage a scenario where if there's a hit and run, let's say, and if you hit from behind and if it's late at night in a remote area and there's no witnesses, how are you going to establish, fault? And so that's just one scenario. So sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes it's more straightforward, and there's a police investigation, and the driver might be charged, and fault is established. But that's a process that you end up waiting for. There's more time, etc.
Right.
So removing that burden of proving fault of a driver is huge. And like I said, we've seen that in some of the payments we've already made, and so you can imagine just looking at that burden alone, how many people would have missed out on compensation over the years because of the inability to prove fault. And now just taking that away. So when someone walks into our office and talks to us about a motor vehicle accident and an application for compensation, we don't ask them whose fault it was, or we don't require them to establish fault. We do look at the police reports, and we do have some exclusions, and I can talk to you about some of those. And those and only in those situations where there's a driver involved, particularly, where we would look for circumstances which might fall under those exclusions. But otherwise, if you're an innocent pedestrian or passenger, etc., we will never be asking for you to establish fault. And that's just one hurdle that was there. The legal processes that took place was a challenge. And of course, with legal battles, many cases drag on. We've still got people who come to us whose cases have been pending for years, and still they've had no redress.
Right.
And it was things like that that basically prompted government to basically intervene into the state of affairs and say, there's got to be a better way of doing this. And so the scheme was introduced to make things easier for victims of accidents. And then the same thing as in the motor vehicles, in the employment space. So in the employment space, you also no longer have to prove fault of the employer. If you are injured, if there's an injury or there's a death arising out of it in the course of employment, that's all that you need to establish, some basic things around that, without having to blame your employer, which can then be a barrier going forward. There's no need for legal proceedings, etc. You just have to establish those basic requirements, and you'll be entitled to compensation.
We'll have more for you right after this. Welcome back. Mr. Akbar, there's been a lot of talk in the media, especially about the no-fault compensation scheme. Now, before the break, you of course explained that it basically entails you not having to explain whose fault it was. But is it more than that?
It basically is that release of that burden on the victim, and taking away that burden is quite significant. And if we look at some of the examples of cases that have come through, and in fact a prominent one that many might remember is the Nambo accident last year, with those kids on the way to a sporting event and so on. Right. That involved a number of deaths as well as injuries. And now, fortunately, the circumstances were most unfortunate, but thanks to the introduction of the Accident Compensation Act, and thanks to this law, we were in a position to be able to process all the applications that arose from that accident in a manner whereby we were not looking for fault of any of those passengers, and any of those, and many of them were young students on the way to that event, and so it makes that conversation easier. It's just so much fairer and easier on the families. Because we've got to keep in mind, we are dealing with people who've lost loved ones, who've lost children in that accident, and so as a nation, to have a scheme which supports the conversation and supports basically a process whereby all we have to say to the parents of those children that here are some basic things that we'd like to get from you. And of course the scheme, the Commission takes an approach which is very supportive and we're quite proactive in the way we deal with applicants, because we are conscious of the fact that these are people who've either lost loved ones or these are families or people who are injured themselves and in pain and suffering. And so, we're mindful how we talk to them and deal with them. And so we assist with form filling and we really go out of the way to make sure that their engagement with the Commission is a constructive one, taking into account their circumstances. So we felt blessed, if you like, to be able to have a conversation with them where we weren't looking to assign fault to anyone.
Right.
The only area where we would be looking to see whether any exclusions apply is in that Namboa accident. There were 2 drivers, for example, and so the circumstances around their licenses and things like that are examples of what we'd be looking for. But the passengers, we knew straight up from the beginning that it would be an easier conversation because we wouldn't have to get the families to try and establish fault.
So, in fact, on that same note, death versus injury, does the ACCF process them differently? Because according to stats provided, I mean, they're classed differently. You have applications for deaths and you have applications for injuries.
Look, absolutely. And the difference is, I mean, some of the basic requirements are the same. They differ on 1 or 2 requirements. So, for example, in the case of death, obviously we'd be looking for a death certificate, so the notification of the death. We'd be looking for letters of administration or a probate, depending on whether there was a will or not. So when someone dies, the person who's going to be the personal representative of the deceased estate needs to be something that we're aware of, and that's by way of a court order. So we need that. So those things we don't need in an injury space. So some of the requirements change. In terms of the process, with death it's quicker because there's no further assessment to be made regarding the death other than receiving all the documentation. And because we have a fixed amount for death, which is $75,000. With injury, the maximum is $150,000. How much someone gets depends on the assessment that the medical practitioner does. It's called an impairment assessment, a whole person impairment assessment. That percentage determines how much compensation they get. So because of that, the process is longer for injuries. Now the time frame there depends on the extent of the injury. A typical waiting period for an impairment assessment is anywhere between 10 to 18 months. Now that's not anything to do with the system or the process, etc. It's a guideline that medical practitioners follow. Typically, they follow the AMA guidelines, which is the American Medical Association guidelines. And how that works is basically they wait to see whether there's going to be any more healing or not. They want to be sure that there's going to be no further healing, or that the body is fully healed, so that they can then accurately assign a percentage in terms of how much they've been incapacitated. So that there's a difference in the time frame.
And what's the maximum amount that a person can receive for an injury or death?
$150,000 for injury, and for death is $75,000. And if you compare that to the old law, in the employment space, the maximum for injury was $67,000, and I think death was $50,000 for employment injuries and death. If you look at passenger liability for buses, for example, there was a cap of $40,000 for the entire bus. So you'd have victims sharing $40,000. If you look at the Namboa accident, for example, I mean, if you put that into a bus kind of situation, basically each death in the Namboa accident, each person that died, their families have all received $75,000 each. So we've clearly, just looking at the numbers alone, you can see that there's a huge transformation in terms of the way we treat victims of accidents.
Staying on the issue of accidents, from the 1st of Jan to the 31st of May, that's I guess 1 year, 3 months. Within that time, you've had 74 death applications, 44 paid, 21 in process. 9, however, were declined. So why does an application, how can an application get declined?
Sure. There are 2 scenarios which will result in an application being declined. One is that they might not meet the time frame from which the act comes into force. So for motor vehicle accidents, we basically, the act and the regulations commence from 1st of January 2018. So motor vehicle accidents that occurred prior to that date fall outside the scope of the scheme. They are still entitled to receive compensation, but under the previous law. So that would be one reason they wouldn't be entitled to compensation through ACCF. The other reason would be that they might fall under one of the exclusions. We have a handful of exclusions under our regulations, and and so some of the applications may have fallen under those exclusions. For example, if someone is driving under the influence over the prescribed limit, which is 0.35, that would be an exclusion.
All right. So for injury applications as well, so far you've received 437. 390 are still being processed. So just going back to the processing time,
Sure.
On average, how fast can a person expect to receive the compensation? And also on that note, how do you make sure that there isn't a backlog of applications? Do you have the adequate staff and the resources?
Sure. No, we definitely have the adequate staff and resources. We have processes in place for the applications. In terms of the time frames, coming back to what I was saying about the waiting period for the injury, once that assessment's done, whether it's 10 months, whether it's 12 months, etc., once that assessment is received on what the injury is, what the percentages of the injury incapacitation, we'll process it very quickly. So at our end, once we receive everything, it's done very quickly, whether it's death or injury. And so those 390 you mentioned, those are applications that are awaiting the final medical assessment. And again, it's not because of any backlog or anything. It's a medical requirement when you're doing an impairment assessment. That's the time frame that needs to be waited for.
We'll have more for you right after the Mr. Akbar, if we can move on to discussing employment accidents. So within the 3 months, you've started looking at them from January 2019. So the number of death applications during employment, 8, injury applications, 100. So talk to us about some of the types of cases that you've received.
Look, the death applications, they vary. I mean, these are, some of them are people who have actually died in the course of undertaking certain tasks while employed, whether it's the use of machinery and so on. And others have been applications in respect of deaths which have taken place at the workplace. It's just a question of whether it was arising out of or in the course of employment, and that's part of our investigation, because it doesn't necessarily mean that someone dies while on the work premises, that it arose out of and in the course of employment. I mean, it could be natural causes, for example. So this is part of what we need to look at and consider whether there's an entitlement.
And so in the 8 death applications that you had, who are the people that are responsible for reporting it?
Okay, so with the reporting requirement, and this is quite important, for any injury or death in the workplace, it is the employer's responsibility to report it. In terms of reporting, for injury, the time frame is 14 days from the date they become aware of the injury, and for death it's 7 days. There's a standard form, ACCF Form 1, which they fill in, and it's a dual reporting. They send it to the Permanent Secretary of Employment as well as to ACCF. So both of us get notified. This reporting requirement was there from before. It's not new, but previously it was just the PS employment. Now ACCF gets notified as well. So that notification process is separate. What we've also done separately is to ensure there's a separate application process. So the worker or the worker's family, in the case of death, is able to and should apply separately to ACCF. It is no longer, they're no longer beholden to or at the behest of the employer to make that application. And that's one of the challenges we had in the past, where in some cases workers struggled to get cooperation with some of the employers. And that's one of the struggles which is now removed, because they can fill in the form, apply, and come straight to ACCF for compensation, and ACCF will investigate.
So you earlier spoke about the fact that the injury or death has to be during the course of employment.
Yes.
What if the employer submits a dispute that what they were doing wasn't exactly in the course of their employment? They were on, as the legal term is, a frolic of their own.
Yes.
So who adjudicates that dispute?
Well, ACCF will make a decision on with applications for compensation. The decision sits with ACCF, the Commission, and so the team will investigate and make a decision on whether, in the team's view, the accident did arise out of or in the course of employment. And obviously in that regard, statements will be taken, there'll be witnesses to the incident. The medical report will be quite telling in most circumstances. There'll be a reliance on that. ACCF has the authority to get second opinions, etc. So there'll be a full investigation and decisions made, but that decision is made by ACCF.
So far, has the ACCF noticed unscrupulous practices by employers?
What we've found is that the introduction of the no-fault aspect of the scheme, what we found is that introduction has made the process easier for everyone. It's made businesses and employers more receptive of applications for compensation and receptive of the process, because no longer is an employer on the back foot trying to defend themselves and say, well, it wasn't our fault. Previously in some cases they were maybe not objecting to compensation, but they had to take a stand because the employee was forced to blame the employer. So removing that has just made things easier, and I believe made everyone just be a bit more honest about things. Right. And so if an application is made by a worker, the employer just has to verify the circumstances of the accident. And of course, but we will do our own accident.
So looking at some statistics in terms of the causes of injuries from employment accidents, as well as the types of injuries.
Yes.
When we look at the types of injuries, you go from cuts to cuts and lacerations to, for example, dislocation or traumatic amputation. So how is compensation assessed according to the seriousness of the injury?
Right. So when we go back to the assessment I was talking about, it's called a whole person impairment assessment. So the American guidelines are followed, and there's a Fiji guidelines, work care guidelines as well, which has been developed based on that. And the medical practitioner who undertakes this is trained in impairment assessment. So they basically carry out an assessment of your injuries, the nature of those injuries, and how it's impacted the individual as a whole person. So they for example, a typical assessment report might suggest that the injuries to your legs, for example, has resulted in X percentage of your leg being impaired. But the impact on your whole person might be less because that leg might be X percent impaired, but your body is less affected. So it does just depend on the nature of the injuries, and so that's an assessment that these trained doctors do. And assign a final percentage. So they assign a final percentage, which is what we use then to determine compensation.
So does the compensation paid differentiate between general damages and specific damages, or does it account for loss of future earnings?
No. It's not like those typical remedies under common law and so on that you would get. This is specifically compensation for the injury suffered based on an impairment assessment, and that's what's paid in these circumstances.
Have you noticed some trends, just looking at the causes of injuries during employment accidents? We have also noted that the ACCF is doing a lot of awareness work as well on safety, for example, something as simple as wearing a seatbelt, road safety as well.
Yes.
So what would you say about the injuries sustained during employment?
So if you look at the injuries in employment, the biggest causes is just slips, trips and falls. And so one of the things that we do say in our awareness is that some very basic things can be done in the workplace to avoid these injuries. And so removing hazards in the workplace, making sure there's no clutter and so on. So slips, trips and falls are right up there. And you've got things like handling material, and of course machinery. Machinery is obviously a big one. So we've just all got to be careful that, safety is everyone's responsibility. And so employers and businesses have an obligation to ensure the right equipment's there, the workplace is safe, etc. And it's also important that workers take personal responsibility for their own safety. And they're not frolicking around and using machinery like they should. The safeguards, following health and safety procedures, all that's important. So all, I think it's important that we all take personal responsibility for our own safety, but it's beyond that as well. It's not just our own safety, but the safety of others around you. When we're operating in that space, then you're likely to see a significant reduction in employment accidents.
We'll be right back after a break. Mr. Akbar, from January this year, you've also started looking at school accidents as well as employment, as we discussed earlier. When you started off in 2018 looking at just accidents, motor vehicle accidents,
Yes.
And you've started looking at school and employment related. So why did you feel there was a need to do this, to include employment and school injuries as well?
Well, it's something that that actually government was looking to do for some time, and so after a lot of consultation with key stakeholders, government decided to expand the scheme. It was important to, and for all of us at the Commission as well as government, I think government always wanted the compensation space, the workers' compensation space, to be on a no-fault basis, make things easier. There were things like this 3-day medical certificate and so on. There were other things that were complicated and not very victim-friendly in the workers' compensation space. So, government was keen to expand ACCF into that area and make it easier for workers, and workers' rights. And so, in that sense, it's good to see government pushing and expanding the ACCF scope to support workers of Fiji. And when I say that, it's not just, it includes foreign workers, anybody who's got a contract. In fact, we had a question like that recently and around who's covered and so on. You don't have to be a Fijian citizen as a worker. So that was addressing the issues and challenges under the Workmen's Compensation Act. In terms of school accidents, in fact, the scheme has potential to keep growing, and we've got sport injuries and so on in the future. But school accidents was one area that was of immediate need, and that was also recognised by government that we should extend and cover pupils, because it sort of fell in a bit of a hole legally as well, and so it was good to sort of address that first and then continue to expand the scheme in other areas.
So far you've received, from January this year, 2 applications for death.
Yes.
Could you talk to us about these cases?
Yeah, look, I won't go into too much detail because it'll end up identifying the pupil and the families. But one of the accidents I can say was of natural causes, and didn't fall within the definition of a school accident. And it has to be an accident. It has to take place in school premises during normal hours, or it can be anywhere else as long as it's a school activity. So one death didn't fall into that category, and another one was in a similar situation where it didn't fall into the school premises, normal school hours category. So I suppose that's as specific as I could get without identifying those families. But both those applications have been declined because of that. But we're getting, we are continuing to create awareness so that there will be more applications, I'm sure, that will fall within that category.
What's the definition of an accident?
So when you look at a school accident, basically it involves an accident which occurs on school premises during normal school hours. That's one aspect of the definition, and the other one is where it's a school accident that occurs anywhere involving, but basically that's a school event or an activity. So those are the 2 scenarios that will qualify basically for compensation if it falls within that. And
so far you've received 20 injury applications.
Yes. Yes.
All 20 are being processed. What does a parent, or again, who needs to report?
Okay. So just like employment accidents, there's an obligation to report. So the obligation is on the business. For school accidents, the obligation is on the controlling authority of the school. Now, who the controlling authority is, usually the certificate of registration will state that. So all the schools will know who their controlling authority is, and so that person needs to basically report the accident. The time frames are the same. the 14 days for injuries and 7 days for death. And it's the same form. We kept it simple so you can use the same form, ACCF Form 1. In this case, though, with school accidents, and when I say school accidents, we're talking about pupils, not teachers. Teachers are covered, but under the employment accident regime. So they are still covered, right. But the school accident regulations covers pupils. So if there's an injury or a death to a pupil, the controlling authority must report it to the Permanent Secretary of Education and, of course, ACCF. And we've got, if you go to our website or give us a call, we can assist in terms of giving details on how to get in touch with both entities in notifying. And it can be done as simple as an email. So those are the reporting requirements.
So, of course, during employment or school accidents, where we are essentially talking about accidents, but sometimes a death can be, for example, caused by contributory negligence of the employer as well. Does the scheme, in one way or the other, allow employers to get away with such practices?
Okay, and the answer, first of all, the answer is no. So there's two things. There's the entitlement to compensation, which is governed by the Accident Compensation Act and managed, if you like, by the Accident Compensation Commission. And so any applications for compensation come through us, and we will process it with either the victim of the motor vehicle accident, whether it's a worker in the employment space or whether it's a pupil. So that's compensation. In terms of practices that may fall foul, say in the employment space, there's the Health and Safety at Work Act. If there's any practices that fall foul of that, that is something that separately can be prosecuted for, taken up on against the business. If there's an employer,
it's not a bar to further legal.
No, absolutely not. So, so the receipt of compensation by a worker in no way absolves the employer or clears them of any wrongdoing that they might have done. So that's a separate process, and if they've breached any health and safety laws and policies, etc., that's something that they can be managed separately from the Ministry of Employment, etc. And so they are still accountable, and the Health and Safety at Work Act, etc., that remains in place, that hasn't been repealed. And so no one should feel that if they receive compensation, they've given up the right to have their business prosecuted from a health and safety point of view or lodge a complaint about poor safety practices.
Thank you. We'll be back with our final segment right after this. Mr. Akbar, there's been some talk about employers having to pay a levy to the ACCF, and in fact in the 2018-2019 budget it was allocated 0.4% of the 1% levy that is paid. Right. Could you explain?
Sure. Thanks for that question. First of all, employers, businesses do not have to pay anything to ACCF. As a result of the scheme, if the government wanted, they could have introduced a scheme and introduced a requirement that a certain amount be paid to ACCF to fund this aspect, but that wasn't done, and really primarily I think what's taken account of is the fact that there was a desire not to place any additional burden on business, particularly small to medium. And so we are fortunate to be able to expand into the areas of employment and school accidents without having to burden business any further. In fact, by the introduction of these regulations, a huge burden actually has been removed from business in two ways. First of all, the obligation to pay compensation to a worker under the old Act set with the employer, with the business. Now, some of them got insurance for that purpose. That again would be a cost to them. And so both of those costs set with them. But the bigger one being compensation. And so, I mean, if there was a significant award from the courts, for example, in favor of a worker against a business for compensation, a small business, if you have a significant award, can shut a business down. So in that sense, actually, not only do they not have to pay anything to ACCF, in fact, by introducing the employment accident regulations and placing the obligation of paying compensation on ACCF, that a huge burden has actually been removed from businesses in Fiji. And so there's no need but for businesses to pay anything to ACCF.
So businesses, I mean, are not paying not directly paying to the.
No, our funding actually, what they need to continue doing is paying the FNU levy,
Right.
so the 1%, and we get, as you say, 40% of that levy. Now that the FNU levy is not a new thing. It's unrelated to ACCF in the sense that that's an obligation that existed in the past. They just have to continue complying with the obligation, and we will of course get 40% of that to assist with the payment of compensation.
And our final point of discussion, talk to us about some of the reasons why the ACCF does not consider applications, or what types of applications do you not consider?
Well, there are a few scenarios. So, for example, if someone refuses to undergo a medical assessment, and one of the things, the whole basis of being able to pay compensation for injuries is that we rely on an assessment, an impairment assessment. So if someone refuses to do that, then we are unable to process it any further. If there's a fraudulent application, for example, obviously we won't consider that. If we've decided on an application already, then we won't. There's no reopening of the application and so on. So these are some of the scenarios where we won't consider the application.
And earlier on in the show, you also discussed exclusions. The effect of an exclusion, I'm guessing, is that the application will be declined?
That's correct, and they advise of the reason for the exclusion, for declining the application. And you know, there's a handful. The exclusions we have are far more reasonable than what used to be in place before. And you will see, if you look at the exclusions like driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs, they target the person who is in breach of the law, if you like, and who's failing to comply. It doesn't go broader than that and indiscriminately basically penalize everyone who's a victim of an accident, which has happened before. And so I'm very comfortable with the exclusions that we do have in place.
And what about those who may be hesitant to come forward to the ACCF under the impression that they're already insured with an insurance company? Should such people be discouraged from coming to the ACCF?
No, look, absolutely not. One of the things that's really important is, you know, whether you think you have insurance with somebody, some company, or whether you're not sure whether your injuries are serious enough or not, please get in touch. I mean, we're there to assist everyone. And, you know, the worst that can happen is we might say you don't qualify because of A, B, and C. But it's important because they may be entitled to some compensation. So that, you know, and many times, because we're not medical practitioners ourselves, we rely on the assessment. Many times, if someone's walked through the door, we are unable to say for a fact whether they'll get compensation or not. But we do encourage the application because it's an assessment that will be medically made. And so at the end of the day, if the assessment is that there's 0%, for example, incapacity, then there's no compensation that will be paid out, even though they've gone through the whole process. But the thing is, they've got nothing to lose because there's no application fee. And so it's not like you've forked out thousands of dollars in lawyers' fees or anything like that. Right. And so if having gone through that process, if the final impairment assessment suggests there's no impairment at all, then there's no compensation. But do reach out to us. I mean, we're there to assist, absolutely.
For someone, last question, for someone who may not be aware, how does someone get in touch with you?
Well, look, we have our website. All the details are there. We have a Facebook page. In fact, we've been engaging on a daily basis with a lot of people. We do a lot of proactive work on our Facebook page, like road safety messages and so on, but we also answer specific queries. So the Facebook page is Accident Compensation Commission Fiji. I think a lot of people are on Facebook, so that might be easiest, but the website has all the details. And then also you can email us at info@accf.com.fj.
Mr. Akbar, thank you very much for joining us tonight on For the Record. And
My
we
pleasure.
wish you all the best.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
And that's all we have for you on the show tonight. Thanks for joining us. Good evening.